The last song of the night was Born to Run. It always was. But on the evening of July 14th, 1999, at Madison Square Garden in New York City, something happened during those final 4 minutes that nobody in the building had anticipated, least of all the man standing in the front row who had driven 2,000 miles to be there, and who would be dead before the summer was over. His name was Walter Briggs. He was 58 years old, and he had driven from Billings, Montana, to New York City in a 1994 Ford pickup truck over the course of 4 days, stopping at motels along the way, eating at diners, covering roughly 500 miles a day across terrain that flattened, and then rose, and then flattened again, until the flatness gave way to the density of the eastern seaboard, and the city appeared on the horizon like something his son had promised him would be worth the drive. The drive had been his son's idea. Paul Briggs was 26 years old and had moved to New York 3 years earlier to work in construction management. He had called his father in April to tell him that Springsteen was doing a 10-night run at Madison Square Garden, and that he had managed to get 2 front-row tickets, and that he was going to drive to Montana and drive back with his father, if that was what it took to get him there. Walter had said that was ridiculous. Paul had said he knew. Walter had said he wasn't going to let his son drive to Montana just to turn around and drive back. Paul had said he would buy a plane ticket then. Walter had said absolutely not. They had gone back and forth like this for 2 weeks, in the particular way that fathers and sons go back and forth when they are actually talking about something other than what they appear to be talking about. Walter was a man who had spent 31 years working in the rail yards outside Billings, who had raised Paul and his older sister Karen largely on his own after their mother left when Paul was 9, who believed in self-sufficiency the way some people believe in religion, not as a choice, but as a condition, something built into the structure of how he understood the world. He did not ask for things. He did not accept things that required too much from other people. He had learned this early and reinforced it across 3 decades of getting up before sunrise and coming home after dark and making sure the children had what they needed without discussing the cost of providing it. But he had also, in the way of men who have kept things to themselves for a long time, begun to feel the weight of everything he had not said. The diagnosis had come in February. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist had been careful and precise and kind in the specific way that oncologists learn to be kind, which is a kindness that contains honesty rather than replacing it. Walter had listened to everything the doctor said and had asked practical questions about treatment timelines, and had driven home and made dinner and called Karen and told her. And then he had called Paul and told him. And Paul had been quiet for a long time on the phone and then said, "Dad, I want to come home." Walter had said, "You don't need to do that." Paul had said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." Walter had said he would think about it. 2 weeks later, Paul called about the Springsteen tickets. Walter understood, later, that this had been Paul's way of doing what he wanted to do, which was to be with his father, in a form that Walter could accept. Not a vigil, not a goodbye, a road trip, a concert. 2 men in a truck doing something ordinary that happened to be the last ordinary thing they would do together. Walter drove himself to New York. He would not let Paul come to Montana, would not accept that much, but he would drive east, and his son would meet him there, and they would have 4 days in the city before the concert, and then the concert itself, And then Walter would drive home and begin the treatment that the doctors had outlined, and they would see what happened. He arrived in New York on a Tuesday. Paul had taken the week off work. They did things that Walter had never done. Walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, took the ferry to Staten Island and back, ate dinner at a restaurant in Little Italy where the tables were outside on the sidewalk and the street was loud with summer, and Paul ordered wine and Walter had a beer, and they talked for 3 hours about things they had not talked about before. Not the cancer, not the treatment. About Paul's mother, a little, carefully. About the rail yard. About Karen and her kids, Walter's grandchildren, whom Walter saw twice a year and thought about constantly. About a fishing trip they had taken when Paul was 12 that neither of them had mentioned in years. A long weekend in Wyoming when everything had gone wrong in minor ways. The tent leaked. They caught nothing. It rained for 2 of the 3 days. And which had been, Walter said that night at the table in Little Italy, one of the best trips of his life. Paul said he felt the same way. They didn't talk about why. The night of the concert, July 14th, they took the subway to Midtown and walked to Madison Square Garden through the summer heat. Walter had never been to an arena concert. The largest thing he had attended was a county fair. The scale of it, the crowd, the noise, the production, was something he spent the first 20 minutes simply absorbing, standing in the front row with his arms at his sides, watching the stage crew make final adjustments. Then Springsteen came out. Walter knew the music. You couldn't be 58 years old in America and not know the music, even if you had never sought it out, even if it had always been background to other things. But hearing it in a room this size, at this volume, with his son standing next to him in the front row, was not background. It was foreground in a way Walter had not been prepared for. By the 3rd song, his arms had uncrossed. By the 6th song, he was moving in the way that people move when the music has gotten inside something they were keeping still. By the 10th song, he had stopped thinking about anything except what was in front of him, which was the music and the crowd, and his son standing next to him with the same expression on his face that he had worn at 12 years old on the Wyoming fishing trip when everything went wrong, and it was somehow perfect. Springsteen played for 3 hours. Near the end of the set, before the encore, he came to the edge of the stage and looked out at the front row in the way he always did, the way that made everyone in the front row feel like the concert had narrowed to include only them. He looked at Walter. Walter was not crying. He was not displaying anything visible. But there was something in his face, the particular quality of a man who is experiencing something he knows he will not experience again, who is holding it, and knowing he is holding it, and trying to hold it carefully enough that it doesn't slip, that Springsteen recognized. He had seen that face before. He had written songs about that face. After the encore, after Born to Run, as the house lights began to come up and the crowd began its slow movement toward the exits, a security guard appeared at Walter's elbow and said that Mr. Springsteen would like to meet him backstage if he was willing. Paul said later that he had never seen his father look surprised before that moment. Surprised in the way of a man who has stopped expecting the world to offer things without being asked. They were brought backstage. Springsteen was still drenched in sweat from the show, a towel around his neck, and he shook Walter's hand with both of his and asked him his name and where he had come from. And Walter told him, and Springsteen said 2,000 miles was a long way to drive for a concert. and Walter said his son had talked him into it. Springsteen looked at Paul. Then he looked back at Walter. And then he said, "What made tonight the night?" Walter was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who explained himself easily, who had the habit of making his interior life available. But he looked at Springsteen and understood, somehow, that the question was being asked by someone who genuinely wanted the answer. And he said, "I'm sick. And my son wanted to do something with me before I couldn't do things anymore. And he knew I'd never let him do something just for me, so he made it about the music." Springsteen nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't fill the space with anything. He just let what Walter had said exist in the room for a moment, the way you let something exist when you understand that it doesn't need a response so much as it needs to be witnessed. Then he said, "Your son knows you pretty well." Walter looked at Paul. Paul was looking at the floor. His jaw was tight the way jaws get tight when a person is holding something together with the muscles of their face. Walter said, "He does." They stayed backstage for 45 minutes. Springsteen signed a photograph for Karen's kids. He asked Walter about the rail yard, about Billings, about Montana in the winter. He talked about the drives he used to take through the western states, the specific quality of the landscape, the way the light was different there than anywhere else. He said someday he wanted to write something that was set entirely in that part of the country, that he had never found the right story for it yet. Walter said when he did, to make sure the character drove a Ford. Springsteen laughed. Walter laughed. Paul, who had been quietly holding himself together for the better part of an hour, put his hand on his father's shoulder and laughed too. They drove back to Paul's apartment in Brooklyn afterward and sat on the fire escape until 2 in the morning, not talking much, watching the city be itself below them. Walter left the next morning. He drove home over 4 days, the same motels, the same diners, the terrain reversing itself from dense to flat, to enormous, to the specific immensity of Montana, which was the immensity he knew, and which meant, when it appeared, that he was almost home. He began treatment in August. He died on November 3, 1999, at home in Billings, with Karen and Paul beside him. At his funeral, Paul spoke for 8 minutes. He talked about the rail yard and the fishing trip, and the way his father had made breakfast every morning for 18 years without being asked and without mentioning it. He talked about the drive to New York and the concert and the fire escape at 2 in the morning. He said his father had been a man who showed love by being present rather than by saying so, who had spent 30 years making sure his children had what they needed without ever suggesting that this cost him anything. He said the last ordinary thing they had done together was sit on a fire escape in Brooklyn and watch the city and not say much. He said it had been enough. He said it had been more than enough. He said, "He drove 2,000 miles because I asked him to." That's who he was. That's the whole story. Walter Briggs is buried in a cemetery outside Billings with a view of the Rim Rocks, the sandstone cliffs that line the northern edge of the Yellowstone Valley. Paul visits every year, usually in July, usually around the anniversary of the concert. He brings his daughter, who is 7 now and has her grandfather's eyes and his particular quality of stillness, the way of being present in a room without requiring anything from it. He has not yet told her the full story. He is waiting until she is old enough to understand what it means to drive 2,000 miles for something you will only get to do once. He thinks she will understand it when the time comes. She has her grandfather's eyes. There is a detail about the drive home that Paul only learned years later, from a motel receipt he found in his father's belongings when he was going through them after the funeral. Walter had stopped on the third day of the drive home, in a small town in South Dakota, at a motel he had stayed at on the way out as well. He had checked in, eaten dinner at the attached diner, and then, according to the receipt, which was time-stamped, he had gone back to his room at 7 in the evening and stayed there until 9 the next morning. 14 hours. Walter, who had never slept more than 6 hours in Paul's memory, who was up before 5 every morning of his working life without an alarm, had stayed in that motel room for 14 hours. Paul does not know what his father did in that room. He does not know if he slept, or sat by the window looking at the South Dakota dark, or called Karen, or simply lay on the motel bed and let the previous week exist inside him without needing to do anything about it. He will never know. Walter was not a man who left records of his interior life. But Paul keeps the receipt. It is in the same drawer as the signed photograph from Backstage, the one Springsteen signed for Karen's kids that Walter brought home and gave to his daughter the week before he started treatment. It is a Holiday Inn receipt for one night's stay, dated July 18, 1999, in a town called Murdo, South Dakota, population 500. Paul has driven through Murdo twice since then, both times on his way to or from visiting Karen in Billings. Both times he has pulled off the highway and driven past the Holiday Inn, which is still there, still the same low building with the same sign, and both times he has sat in the parking lot for a few minutes without getting out of the car. He has never been able to explain, to himself or anyone else, exactly what he is doing when he does this. The closest he has come is to say that it feels like visiting a place where something happened, even though nothing visible happened there, even though there is no marker or record or sign. His father was in that building for 14 hours after a week that contained more than most years. Something happened in there. Paul does not need to know what it was to know that it mattered. The 7-year-old with her grandfather's eyes has been to Billings 3 times. She has stood at the cemetery and looked at the rimrocks the way children look at large things, with a kind of open accounting, trying to take in the full scale of something that is larger than her current frame of reference. She has not asked yet why they come, or who the man in the ground is relative to her own life, except in the most basic terms. Paul is not in a hurry. He knows that some things arrive in their own time, that the story of Walter Briggs and the 2,000-mile drive and the front row of Madison Square Garden and the fire escape in Brooklyn at 2 in the morning is a story that will mean different things to his daughter at 7 and at 12 and at 26, which is how old Paul was when he bought the tickets and talked his father into making the drive. He is waiting for the right version of the story to become available to her. In the meantime, he drives to Billings in July. He stands at the cemetery. He looks at the rimrocks the way his daughter looks at them, trying to take in the full scale of something larger than his current frame of reference. He thinks his father would have found this funny. The standing and looking, the annual drive, the motel receipt in the drawer. He thinks his father would have said, "You didn't need to do all that." He thinks his father would have been wrong. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with your father, or your son, or anyone you have been meaning to do something with before the chance is gone. Have you ever taken a trip that turned out to be about something more than the destination? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the moments that remind us why music exists.